On February 16, 1921, 38-year-old Louise Wolf, a high school principal in Parma, Ohio, and 24-year-old teacher Mabel Foote left their school at the usual time of 5 p.m. to walk to the trolley that would take them home. The two were seen by a local farmer leaving the school, but would never be seen alive again. From the south shore of Lake Erie, this is Great Lakes True Crime. With a population of over 81,000 people, Parma, Ohio is the seventh largest city in the state of Ohio and is the largest suburban city in the state. It's a suburb just southwest of Cleveland in northeast Ohio. Today, Parma is home to 3 high schools, 2 hospitals, a community college, several large retail districts, and a General Motors plant, among many other businesses. In 1921, however, Parma wasn't even a city yet. It was an unincorporated township with about 2,000 people scattered throughout its predominantly agricultural land. Parma had only one high school, and that high school had only 2 teachers, Principal Louise Wolf and Mabel Foote. The high school was actually divided into 2 schoolhouses, both located at the intersection of Ridge and Bean Roads. Bean Road was not the 5-lane concrete thoroughfare that is today known as Ridgewood Drive. Back then, it was a narrow dirt road surrounded by farms. The road had an embankment running alongside it, on top of which a wooden fence marked the boundary of an orchard. There were no houses nearby, and the road was very lightly traveled. During rain or snowy times, it was extremely muddy. A little before 8:30 a.m. on February 17, 1921, 16-year-old Edith Rittenauer and her 14-year-old brother Edward, as well as 6-year-old Ralph Pickard, were walking their normal route to school in Parma. As they trudged through the brutal winter ice and snow along Bean Road, they stumbled upon a truly horrifying scene. It was a sight they would never forget. What the 3 youngsters saw on that cold winter day in 1921 at first looked like a bundle of some type of debris in the snow. With their curiosity piqued, the trio got closer to investigate. It was then that they were horrified to see 2 bludgeoned bodies lying near the sidewalk. Not recognizing the identities of the bodies, the 3 children ran to their school as fast as they could to get help. Instead of running inside the building, though, they saw that all the other students were standing outside the school, waiting to be let in. The 3 screamed out to no one in particular about what they had found. It was then that some of the older students started to connect the dots. Their school building had always been unlocked well before school started by their principal, Louise Wolf, and their teacher, Mabel Foote. The pupils yelled across the street for help from Frank Owen, a carpenter who was working on a new high school being built across the street. The schoolhouses were only being used temporarily until the new school was finished, so Frank and the group of students all walked back to the scene to see what had happened. It turns out that Frank's wife, Lottie, was a sister of the school's principal, Louise. When they came upon the scene and Frank saw the bodies, he immediately recognized one of them as his sister-in-law. Mabel Foote, who again was only 24 years old, had just graduated a year earlier from Baldwin Wallace College in nearby Berea, Ohio. She taught the freshmen and sophomores at the school. Mabel lived with her parents, Joel and Ella, and her siblings on Shaft Road in nearby Brooklyn Heights. She would frequently spend the night at the home of her cousin, Mary Shankford, who lived nearby. Louise Wolf, who was the 38-year-old school principal, taught the juniors and seniors. It's been reported that Louise had lived a very difficult life. Her parents died while she was a child, and she and her siblings were separated after being adopted by different families. As an adult, Louise lived with a woman named Effie Buffle. At that time, it was common for unmarried teachers to live with another person to help pay for living expenses. There were rumors that the two may have been more than just roommates, but no one knows whether that was true. In any case, Louise and Mabel had a daily routine at work. The school day would end at 3:30 p.m., and the two would stay afterward to grade papers and clean the classrooms. At 5 p.m., they would make a nearly 2-mile walk to catch the 5:30 p.m. streetcar at the corner of Bean and State Roads. When the students discovered the bodies, Louise was found laying face down with her face having been severely battered. She had a broken nose and several cuts on her body. One of her rubber shoe covers, or what we used to simply call rubbers, was behind her, while the other was still on her foot. Her clothes had been torn, but her belongings were all still with her. Mabel's body was face up, but was farther away from the road near the orchard. She had also been beaten with various cuts and bruises on her. Her purse was found between the two bodies, with the money still in it. Her umbrella was bent and the tip was missing, suggesting that Mabel had used it in an attempt to fend off their attacker. There was also evidence that Mabel did not die immediately from the attack. She made her way to her overnight bag, from which she retrieved a nightgown and wiped the blood off her face. Mabel likely died later from blood loss or exposure. The killer likely knew of the women's daily routine and had probably lived in the area at least previously. Because Mabel's watch had stopped at 5:15 p.m., police believe that was the time of the attack. Footprints left in the mud indicated that there was only one attacker, who police believed was almost certainly male. It was reported that every able-bodied man in the area who could get off work helped search the nearby woods and orchards. Footprints were discovered leading to an old chicken coop a few hundred yards from Bean Road, and police surmised that the killer, who was likely covered in blood, hid there until dark and then made his getaway. The weather had been quite treacherous around the time of these crimes, with rain and snow erasing potential evidence. Dogs, for example, were unable to follow the killer's scent through the woods. On top of that, the road was so muddy that vehicles couldn't travel down it to even pick up the bodies. Instead, they had to be carried to the school. Not surprisingly, the local residents were beyond shocked by these brutal murders. Many were afraid to leave their homes, knowing there was a violent killer at large. But they were also saddened by the loss of Louise and Mabel. The two of them had played an important role in the community and were widely admired. Police were determined to solve this case, questioning anyone who was even slightly suspicious. No one went in or out of town without being questioned, and any little scratch or bruise on a person meant that they would be questioned. There were 2 early suspects questioned by police, but the only thing really working against them is that they didn't have a credible account of where they had been during the time of the murder. Neither had any scratches on them, and they were both eventually cleared. So, police worked countless hours on the case, but ultimately to no avail. There were a few suspects here and there, but nothing really solid. One of the Parma Township trustees, the man named J.D. Loader, said he saw 2 men wearing muddy clothes pass by his house the evening that the murders occurred. Another area resident claimed that a man holding a club of some sort was looking into her windows a few nights before the crimes. However, none of these men were ever located or even identified. The investigation did take a sharp turn, however, a couple months after the murders. In April 1921, police received a letter signed by, quote, a Lorraine Avenue citizen, and the person who wrote the letter claimed to have been a witness to the murders. It's important to note that Lorraine Avenue is a main thoroughfare on the west side of the city of Cleveland. The closest point of Lorraine Avenue to the murder scene is about 8 miles as the crow flies. So while it's not super far from the murders, it's also not in the immediate area. Back in that time, it would have been a decent journey from one location to the other. The letter writer stated he knew who the person was that committed the murders and provided a name of the alleged murderer. Police immediately began searching for the person named, and they found him. They brought him in for questioning, during which the man admitted that he was the one who actually wrote the letter. So this man wrote a letter to police identifying himself as the killer. Police kept looking into the letter, though. They consulted an expert in Bertillon, which involved the use of photography to document crime scenes and evidence before they were disturbed by investigators. This expert concluded that the fingerprints on the letter were similar to fingerprints found on one of the teacher's textbooks. After that, the letter writer was taken to the scene of the crime, where he provided a detailed account of what happened there. Aside from that, witnesses reported seeing the man near the crime scene at various times, both before and after the murders. One person said they saw him standing and watching a drain pipe being installed near the crime scene just hours before the murders. The man behind these vicious crimes, it seemed, had finally been identified. Police theorized that the man's family helped him out by burning his bloody clothes after the murders, although the family categorically denied this accusation. The family also alerted police to the fact that the man, who was never publicly identified, was mentally unstable. Police eventually concurred with his mental instability after finding out that he had long been totally obsessed with murder cases. A mental health professional interviewed the letter writer and found that he had the mental capacity of a child. He likely got the details of the crimes from a combination of newspaper stories and his imagination. So this man was ruled out as a suspect. Eventually, the case stalled out and detectives were at wit's end. They had followed up on a ton of leads, but none of them led to any substantial suspects. Residents of Parma Township got together for several community-wide meetings at which they discussed the case, any available evidence, and possible suspects. A large reward was also offered for information that helped identify the killer. And Charles Foote, Mabel's uncle, had the opinion that killers sometimes returned to the scene of their crime, so he began going to the area every evening for a while, looking for anything suspicious. While this made some local residents kind of ill at ease, it seemingly provided no help in solving the case. Police began to step up the pressure on anyone that had even the slightest possible connection to the case. They began intensely interrogating these people, and local men were so intimidated by these practices that they began to voluntarily provide their fingerprints just to avoid an appearance of guilt. Local police were joined by detectives from the Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Office and the City of Cleveland Police Department. Still, they came up with nothing. Separate funeral services for Mabel and Louise were held on February 20th, 1921, 4 days after their murders. They were each buried in their respective families' private cemeteries, although the locations of those cemeteries are not known today. As is still common today, police detectives ran surveillance at both funerals in case they noticed anyone acting suspicious, but no suspicious characters were seen, so no suspects came out of that endeavor either. Police were once again hopeful when a man named Fred Getling complained that he had murdered the two teachers. Getling was a lifelong criminal with a record dating back 16 years to 1905 when he was convicted of manslaughter for killing a man on Christmas night in 1904. After being convicted of that crime, Getling was found to be insane and was confined to the Lima State Hospital for the criminally insane. He would be released after just over 2 years, and then would be convicted of burglary about 6 months later. For the burglary conviction, Getling served 10 years in prison, during which time he threatened to kill the warden with a razor that he had in his possession. As an aside, for regular listeners of this show, you may recall that this is not the first time we've mentioned the Lima State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Celie Rose, the subject of episode 19, was also sent to the same facility where she ultimately died. Eventually, Getling's confession of killing Mabel and Louise was dismissed by authorities, and he was cleared of the murders. Not long after that, he murdered a man named Harry Kime with an axe, and was sent back to the Lima State Hospital. In that case, the judge stated that he strongly suspected that Getling had murdered the two teachers because, quote, "I cannot make myself believe there are two men so fiendishly brutal as you have shown yourself," unquote. This was in 1923, about 2 years after the murders. Incidentally, the newspaper article I found regarding the axe murder stated that Getling was a 2-time axe murderer. It wasn't clear whether one of those two incidents was the 1904 manslaughter case or something else, though. An organization called the Brooklyn Women's Civic League planned and gathered funds for a memorial to honor the teachers. Their efforts kicked off in 1923, and they eventually raised enough funds to build a memorial to both Mabel and Louise. The memorial was dedicated in 1932 and was placed at the entrance of Brookside Park on Pearl Road in Cleveland. That memorial still stands today, and I recently visited it and took some photos, which will be posted on the Great Lakes True Crime Facebook page. For anyone interested in seeing it, the memorial is in a small park right on Pearl Road at the intersection with Wildlife Way, directly behind the huge Cleveland Metro Park Zoo sign. The name of that small park, by the way, is Foote Wolf Memorial Park. The park had long been a city of Cleveland property, but county records show that ownership of the park transferred to Cleveland Metro Parks in 1991. From what I observed, the area seems to be neglected and could really use some TLC by Cleveland Metro Parks. It has now been over 101 years since these senseless murders, and no one has ever been brought to justice for these crimes. Without a responsible party being identified, we also don't have a motive behind the murders. We do know that robbery does not appear to have been the motive, as both women still had their jewelry, money, and other belongings with them. Sexual assault also doesn't seem to have been a part of these crimes, and investigators did not find that either woman had any enemies or recent arguments with anyone. As mentioned earlier, Louise lived with a woman named Effie Buffle, and it's been reported that rumors at the time suggested that the two were more than just roommates. If this were true, the possibility of a love triangle or jealous lover was attached to one theory about the crimes. The theory asserts that Effie was potentially jealous of the closeness that Louise had with Mabel, and perhaps even had a relationship with. In this theory, Effie could have perhaps murdered both women, contradicting the police assumption that a man committed the crimes. While not a terribly likely scenario, this would explain why neither woman appeared to run from the perpetrator. Another theory involves Mabel and her involvement with a charity organization. Mabel kept the books for this group, and this theory holds that she uncovered wrongdoing in the organization, and someone murdered her and stole the accounting book, which she was said to have had in her travel bag that was found with her body. To me, that concerned Lorraine Avenue citizen is a more likely perpetrator than those proposed in either of these theories. The fact that he knew details of the murders and sent police a letter about the murders is very suspicious. An even more likely suspect, though, would be Fred Getling, in my opinion. The fact that he seemed to kill without any discernible motive twice before is cause for alarm. Plus, the judge in the axe murder case, who certainly had access to far more information on the case than we do now, seemed to be convinced that Getling was the murderer of Mabel and Louise. Why he was cleared by investigators is not entirely clear, but he may have gotten away with 2 murders. We may never know for sure, though. And that's all for this episode. Again, check out the Great Lakes True Crime Facebook page for photos of the memorial to Mabel and Louise, which still stands today. Thanks for your positive reviews and support of the show. Be sure to check out our website, and please touch base on Twitter or Facebook. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. And finally, check out the show notes for more information. And also, for a real quick Netflix review and suggestion, I recently caught up with Swap Shop on Netflix, and this show has nothing to do with true crime or any type of crime for that matter. But if you're looking for an escape from this genre, Swap Shop was pretty interesting. It's ostensibly based on a radio show called Swap Shop, but it really follows several groups of people who go around looking for some rare finds that they can turn around and sell for a profit in their antique and novelty stores. It inspired me to try to sell a few things that I had laying around the house too, by the way. So that's Swap Shop. It's on Netflix. Season 2 just dropped in February. Anyways, for Great Lakes True Crime, this has been your host and producer, Steve. Thanks for listening, guys.